The Wave, Chapter 8. Both David and Lori lived within walking distance of Gordon High. David's route didn't necessarily lead past Lori's house, but ever since 10th grade, he'd always gone out of his way. When he first noticed her as a sophomore, he used to walk down her street on the way to school every morning, hoping that he would pass her house just as she was leaving for school. At first, he managed to run into her only about once a week, but as the weeks passed and they got to know each other, he began to catch her more frequently until by the spring they walked together almost every day. For a long time, David thought this was just a matter of luck and good timing. Guys always think that. It never occurred to him that from the beginning, Lori had waited at her window. Top of page 82, watching for him. At first, she had only pretended to run into him once a week. Later, she ran into him more often. David picked Lori up to walk with her to school the next morning. He was bursting with brainstorms. "I'm telling you, Lori," he said as they walked along the sidewalk toward school. "This is just what the football team needs." What the football team needs, Lori told him, is a quarterback who can pass, a running back who doesn't fumble, and a couple of linebackers who aren't afraid to tackle an end who... "Stop it," David said irritably. "I'm serious. I got the team into it yesterday. Brian and Eric helped me. The guys really responded to it. I mean, it's not like we're improved in only one practice, but, I could feel it. I could really feel the team spirit. Even Coach Schiller was impressed. He said we were more like a new team." "My mother says it sounds like brainwashing to her," Lori said. "What?" "She says Mr. Ross is manipulating us." "She's crazy," David said. "How could she know? And besides, what do you care about what your mother says? You know she worries about everything." "I didn't say I agreed with her," Lori said. "Well, you didn't say you disagreed with her either," David said. It's funny how the two, Lori and David, how they're influenced by what their parents have said, and they've got two different kind of views that are coming together or converging now or in conflict with each other. "Well, you didn't say you disagree with her either," David said. "Well, I was just telling you what she said," Lori replied. David wouldn't let it drop. "How does she know anyway? She can't possibly understand what the wave is, what it's about, unless she's been in class to see it work. Parents always think they know everything." Lori suddenly felt an urge to disagree with him, but she restrained herself. She didn't want to start a fight with David over something so petty. She hated it when they quarreled or argued, right? Besides, for all she knew, the wave might be just what the football team needed. They certainly needed something. She decided to change the subject. Did you find help for calculus?" David shrugged. "Nah, the only kids who know anything are in my class. So why not ask one of them?" "No way," David said. "I don't want any of them to know I'm having trouble." Top of page 84. "Why not?" Lori asked. I'm sure someone would help you." "Of course they would," David said, "but I don't want their help." Lori sighed. It was true that lots of kids at school were competitive about grades and class standing. But a few took it too far, as David did. "Well," she said, "I don't know. I know Amy didn't say anything at lunch, but if you can't find anyone else, she could probably help you." "Amy? She's incredibly smart in math," Lori explained. "I bet you could give her your problem and she'd have it figured out in 10 minutes. "But I asked her at lunch," David said. "Yeah, she was just being shy," Lori said. "I think she likes Brian and she doesn't want to intimidate him by seeming too brainy." David laughed. "I don't think she has to worry, Lori. The only way she could intimidate him was if she weighed 200 pounds and wore a Clarkstown uniform." When the students arrived in class that day, there was a large poster in the back of the room with a blue wave symbol on it. Remember we talked about symbols before. Symbols are powerful because they can represent a lot of things, ideas, movements, groups of things, right? Concepts. They found Mr. Ross dressed differently than usual. Where before he'd come to class in casual clothes, today he wore a blue suit, a white shirt, and a tie. The students went quickly to their seats as their teacher walked up and down the aisles, passing out small yellow cards. Brad nudged Lori. "It's not time for report cards," he whispered. Lori stared at the card she'd received. "It's a Wave membership card," she whispered back. "What?" Brad hissed. "All right," Mr. Ross slapped his hands together loudly. "No talking." Brad sat up straight in his seat, but Lori understood his surprise. Membership cards? It must have been a joke. Meanwhile, Mr. Ross had finished distributing the cards and stood in the front of the room. "Now you will all have membership cards," Mr. Ross announced. "If you turn them over, you will find that some of them have been marked with a red X. If you have a red X, you are to be a monitor, and you will report directly to any of the members of the Wave who do not obey the rules." Wow, this is kind of crazy. Probably that's noteworthy, right? There's like this procedure. They're all getting cards, and then certain people have this red X, and the red X people are the ones that are supposed to report on anyone that doesn't follow the rules. That was page 85. This is page 86. Around the room, students were scrutinizing their cards. They were looking at them with detail, right? Trying to understand them, make sense of them, and turning them over to see if they had a red X. Those who had them, like Robert and Brian, were smiling. Those who didn't, like Lori, seemed less pleased. Lori raised her hand. "Yes, Lori," Ben said. What's the point of this?" Lori asked. There was a silence around the room, and Ben did not answer right away. Then he said, "Aren't you forgetting something?" "Oh, right." Lori got up and stood next to her desk. "Mr. Ross, what's the point of these cards?" Ben had expected someone to question him on the cards. The reasons for them would not be apparent immediately. For now, he said, "It's just an example of how a group might monitor itself." Lori had no other questions, so Ben turned to the blackboard and added another word to strength through discipline, strength through community. Today's word was action. Now that we understand discipline and community, he told the class, action is our next lesson. Ultimately, discipline and community are meaningless without action. Discipline gives you the right to action. A disciplined group with a goal can take action to achieve it. They must take action to achieve it. Class, do you believe in the wave? There was a split-second hesitation, and then the class rose in unison and answered in what seemed like a single voice, "Mr. Ross, yes." Mr. Ross nodded. "Then you must take action. Never be afraid to act on what you believe. As the wave, you must act together like a well-oiled machine. Through hard work and allegiance to each other, you will learn faster and accomplish more, but only if you support one another, and only if you work together and obey the rules can you ensure the success of the wave." As he spoke, the class members stood beside their desks at attention. Lori Saunders stood with them, but she did not feel the high energy and unity she'd felt on previous days. In fact, today there was something about the class, something about their single-mindedness and absolute obedience to Mr. Ross that she would almost describe as creepy. "Be seated," Mr. Ross ordered, and instantly the class sat. Their teacher continued his lesson. "When we first began," top of page 88, "the wave a few days ago, I felt that some of you were actually competing to give the right answers and to be better members than others. From now on, I want this to end. You are not competing against each other. You are working together for a common cause. You must conceive of yourselves as a team of which you are all members. Remember, in the wave, you are equals. No one is more important or more popular than anyone else, and no one is to be excluded from the group. Community means equality within the group. Now, your first action as a team will be to actively recruit new members to become a member of the wave. Each new student must demonstrate knowledge of our rules and pledge strict obedience to them. Oh, David smiled as Eric looked over at him and winked. This was what he needed to hear. There was nothing wrong with turning other kids onto the wave. It was for the good of everybody, especially the football team. Mr. Ross had continued his talk on the wave. He intended to spend the rest of the period reviewing the assignment and he'd given the class the night before. But suddenly a student named George Snyder was raising his hand. Yes, George. George sprang from his seat to attention by his desk. Mr. Ross, for the first time I feel like I'm part of something, he announced. Something great. Around the room, startled students stared at George. Feeling the eyes of the class upon him, George began to sink back into his chair. But then Robert suddenly stood. Mr. Ross, he said proudly, I know just how George feels. It's like being born again. No sooner had he returned to his seat than Amy stood. George is right, Mr. Ross. I feel the same way. Wow, Amy? That's Laurie's best friend. David was pleased. He knew that what George had done was corny, but then Robert and Amy had done it too, just so George wouldn't feel foolish and alone. That's what was good about the wave. They supported each other. Now he stood up and said, Mr. Ross, I'm proud of the wave. The sudden outburst of testimonials surprised Ben. He was determined to get on to the day's classwork, but suddenly he knew he had to go along with the class a little longer. Almost subconsciously, he sensed how much they wanted him to lead them, and it was something he felt he could not deny. Right? He felt like he had to do this. He felt like he had to keep going. Page 90. Our salute, he ordered. Around the room, students jumped to attention beside their desks and gave the wave salute. The mottos followed. Strength through discipline, strength through community, strength through action. Mr. Ross was picking up his class notes, and the students burst forth again, this time giving the salute and chanting their motto without prompting, right? They did it on their own, which is kind of weird. The silence fell over the room. Mr. Ross gazed at the students in wonderment. The wave was no longer just an idea or a game. It was a living movement in his students. Yeah, he created a monster, right? He created this thing, this wave, that started like its own, literally its own wave of energy through the students and started moving, right? It started happening on its own without the teacher. They were the wave now, and Ben realized that they could act on their own without him if they wanted. That thought could have been frightening, but Ben was confident that he had control as their leader. The experiment was simply becoming much more interesting. At lunch that day, all the wave members who were in the cafeteria sat at a single long table. Brian, Brad, Amy, Laurie, and David were there. At first, Robert Billings seemed tentative about joining them, but when David saw him, he insisted he sit at the table, telling him they were all part of the wave now. Most of the kids were raving about what was going on in Mr. Ross's class, and Laurie really had no reason to argue with them, but still she felt odd. All that saluting and chanting. Finally, during a pause in the conversation, she said, does anyone feel kind of strange about this? David turned to her. What do you mean? Well, I don't know, Laurie said, but doesn't it feel a little weird? It's just so different, Amy told her. That's why it feels weird. Yeah, Brad said. It's like there's no in crowd anymore. Man, the thing that bugs me the most about school sometimes is all the little cliques, right? All the little groups. I'm tired of feeling like every day is a big popularity contest. That's what's so great about the wave. You don't have to worry about how popular you are. We're all equal. We're all part of the same community. Do you think everyone likes that? Lori asked. Do you know anyone who doesn't? David asked. Lori felt her face grow flushed. Well, I'm not sure I do. Suddenly, Brian pulled something out of his pocket and held it up to Lori. Hey, don't forget, he said. Top of page 92. Don't forget, he said. He was holding up his Wave membership card with the red X on the back. Forget what? Lori asked. You know, Brian said. What Mr. Ross said about reporting anyone who breaks the rules. Uh-oh, he's about to call her out on her dissent, right? Her conflict with the rules. Lori was shocked. Brian really couldn't be serious, could he? Now Brian started to grin, and she relaxed. Besides, David said, Lori isn't breaking any rule. If she really went against the wave, she would be, if she was really against the wave, she would be, Robert said. The rest of the table became silent, surprised that Robert had said anything. Some of them weren't even used to hearing his voice. He usually said so little. What I mean is, Robert said nervously, the whole idea of the wave is that people in it have to support it. Keywords, have to, right? Remember that. If we're really a community, we all have to agree. What a great line. If we are really a community, we all have to agree. Now, the word community, the root part of this word is to commune, which means to come together, right? So you can't have a real community unless you come together. But there's really nothing in the meaning of community that says that you have to agree, right? We can all come together, and we can come together even in disagreement or conflict. Coming together really has nothing to do with agreement, other than the fact that you agreed to come together. But sometimes we are apart, or we are simply alone, but still together. Kind of doesn't make sense, but it does it. It does. Alone, together. Community, commune, right? Okay. Yes, okay, I'm going to keep going. Lori was about to say something, but she stopped herself. It was the wave that had given Robert the courage to sit at the table with them and to join the conversation. If she argued against the wave now, she would really be implying, is that word, to imply, right? Implying that Robert should go sit by himself again and not be a part of their community. Brad patted Robert on his back. Hey, I'm glad you joined us, he said. Robert blushed and then turned to David. Did he stick anything on my back? He asked. Everyone at the table laughed. Okay, that's the end of chapter 8.